Well, Dr. Mestenhauser, I'd like to ask you a little bit about intercultural competence instruments. We hear a lot about them in our field, and I'm wondering what you see as their potential role in this field of internationalization, and even if there are any benefits to using them.
Yeah, that's a key to understanding of my perspectives, I guess, too, is because I am very research-oriented. Way back in 1961, I attended a seminar on research, application of research in programs for foreign students.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, we put together 180 books. That was the extent of knowledge that existed out here. And we really abstracted some of the knowledge, and I became the editor of that report, which is obviously only available in the archive someplace now. But that got me into a little more limelight, and so I was appointed by NAFSA as the chairman of a research committee, and we had a little group of people. Lee Ziegler from Stanford was the major supporter of that, somebody from Michigan State and so on. It was about 5-6 of us, and put together a newsletter each month about what was happening, what research was published, questionnaires of people that they used and so on. When NAFSA moved then from New York to Washington, the executive director was not willing to relocate to Washington. So there was a vacancy, and that was filled by Hugh Jenkins. And Hugh essentially abandoned the whole program of research. He just dismantled that whole thing out here, and on the ground that NAFSA is practitioners and other researchers. And that kind of label, that kind of character still persists in NAFSA.
Yeah.
It's all for newcomers, mostly, and the research that's being done is only recently when NAFSA created these learning communities, as they call it. And they started producing some pretty good stuff. The problem is that there are so much to study, and that researchers who do anything are usually not using any systems kind of thinking, but in fact are breaking down the field more and more into smaller and smaller units of analysis. So they actually are doing good job in the research, but fragmented the field even more than it is, and it's fragmented pretty much along the line of the curriculum itself too, which is one of the problems that we talked about earlier too. So one of the fragments that we got came as a result of pressure to show what's being done, because it's expensive. And that pressure was to some extent a result of a book that was written about 1977 or 8, which was called The World Crisis in Education. And that book was attractive very much, and was sold immediately, and was revised in about 1988, about 10 years later again too, with the same titles and so on. And in it the author identifies some major changes that happen as a result of the increasing contexts, in which education takes place. There's a lot of controversies involved in it, many theories of it, many countries coming in and so on. Some of the 7 months coincide with the changes already suggested by Martin Trow way back in 1961, and I worked with Martin Trow when I had a brief fellowship at the Berkeley Center there too, so I got to know him quite well. The changes are a result of explosion of knowledge, explosion of enrollments, and these two changes cause other changes.
Sure.
So explosion, I guess they identified some figure like when the increase of students is between 10 and 15% or more.
Wow.
You know, the changes just get triggered off. And they would mean that there is more vice presidents selected, more assistant vice presidents, more assistants to the assistant vice presidents, and so on. And so this happened to me, you know, when I was a director, presumably of the Office of International Education, and all of a sudden I had to do with all these changes in the administration, because before that I had a pretty good access to the president directly and the vice presidents. Now no more. You know, there was the assistant to the assistants, you know, that I had to deal with. And bureaucratization was a result of that, and we still are feeling the controversy of that too.
Yeah.
And the other one, of course, is the explosion of knowledge. And, you know, with that we have not learned how to deal. My own theory is that at some point here the knowledge would exceed our ability to deal with it. And so I think we would probably need to use a different pattern instead of thinking about understanding the depth of every field and what is called the digging the well deeper and deeper. It's going to have to be abandoned. And I'm actually advocating that some of these subjects, like American history, must be condensed into a presentable format that only selects the most important forces creating that kind of history, and the same would be true in other fields. I think we already have, to some extent, examples of that in higher education. For example, journalism does that. You know, that's, but of course they do that instrumentally, like what gets the attention of the public, you know, very instrumental. But in business schools too, the MBA programs are essentially summaries of many fields and so on that they feel the executives need. And I think we need something like that too. The other problem, I think, of that is that most people assume that any academic could manage an international office, and that international education is not a field of its own. So that's another kind of a mindset. Because if it were, you know, it would have to have its own structure, its own budget, and so on, and everybody's watching the budgets. And I have some letters in my files, correspondence, copies of correspondence from faculty senate people to the president about this very issue, and it's quite obvious that, you know, those faculty at that time, I'm absolutely convinced that this is not, all you need to support is travel money to faculty, what they do now. That was the conclusion. The other problem, of course, is that the book, the World Crisis of Education, was really written about the future, to get people to think about the future. And that has been kind of forgotten, because most people who write about future, including strategic planning and so on, is really based on present problems. So there is, you know, very little, because it's difficult to predict the future for the, again, the positivistically oriented faculty. It hasn't happened yet, so you don't study it until it happens. And when it happens, it's already too late, you know. So, and I think there are some indications, you know, that have been done. And I think Darla's PhD dissertation was one of them, based on some good methodologies. And my own example is study that was initially a commercial study, proprietary study that I managed to get from a friend from Stanford Research Institute. You know, there was a group of people who splintered from Stanford and created this money-making organization, and the organization that gave them a whole bunch of millions to conduct a study of what the purchasing needs will be in the future. And the way they approach that is by studying trends. And by studying trends, they were 100 years back. 100 years back in something like 8 or 9 academic disciplines.
Okay.
You know, including physics, including politics, and so on. And as they studied literature for each of those decades and years and so on, they carefully marked changes that happen. And then, so essentially they had a view of the trends and the changes that develop. That is, of course, in line with my own thinking, you know, that individual parts change and help change the system. And so they did, and they predicted what the future will be like. And when I called them to purchase the final version of that, they charged something like $25,000, you know, which I obviously didn't have to. So I kept arguing with them until I talked to the president of the organization himself, and he went down to $1,000, and the Carlson School bought it for me. So it's in the files in the library someplace. And they identified 7 major changes, and that they all will have something to do with the purchasing power. That they didn't want to speculate what the industry will produce, what innovations and so on.
Sure.
And you know, and one of them is changes from the positivistic way of thinking into perspective thinking.
Yes.
I don't remember the other 6, I think, but they all somehow relate to the changes that we have talked about, you know, instead of the kind of the mechanical perspective on the culture. I think you talk about a synthetic kind of thing, instead of let's see, what was the other one there that just came to my mind? I forgot it. But you know, I have identified that in my book before to the
Yes.
7 perspectives out here, and I think I agree with them. It's not part of the literature because it's not been known, you know, it was not published as such, too,
Right.
which is very unfortunate. I was trying to urge them to do that, but the sponsor of this would not allow that. So that was too bad, but we need studies like that, you know, because the future is part of the present, it's part of the past, and it's often not linear. So, you know, a special kind of skill and knowledge, intellectual skill, is needed.
Yeah.
And here is where critical thinking is not sufficient unless you see it from a perspective of a culture. And my own special peeve, I guess, is that we neglect comparative thinking as an intellectual skill. Most people think of comparative thinking in terms of comparative method, but that one is dominated by the discipline that you are studying from. So you are not getting the kind of results about comparative thinking, and yet it's really the key. I think some people are suggesting that it's probably a more important concept than intelligence concept, but comparative thinking is not obviously equivalent to intelligence, but it is everywhere, and does require a knowledge of culture. and yet you say whatever you describe about happening in Japan is comparative, and people don't necessarily realize that, and
Sure.
so as a result of that, they often don't really explain the Japanese culture. And if they do, you know, there may be negative aspects, because every culture has something in it, you know, that other people think is negative.
Sure.
And for our own culture, for example, this extreme individualism is one of the cultural variables that other people really dislike. Because many, even Europeans, are, you know, a lot more social and much oriented to cooperative kind of solution. You know, that was also one of the trends that they suggested, from individualism to cooperation.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Messinette.
Okay.